These are the oldest stories, online at oldstories.net. Rehoboam, the king of Judah, whose domestic policy was centered around high taxes and brutal whippings, has died. His son is going to take over for the next few years while Jeroboam rules up in the northern kingdom of Israel. But the theme of today's episode is confusion. And that starts all the way at the beginning with this guy. His name in Chronicles is Abijah, meaning Yahweh is my father. And the account given of him by the chronicler is pretty much glowing. He isn't the best of all Judahite kings, but the chronicler definitely puts him pretty high on the list. Then, in Kings, his name is instead given as Abijam, with an M on the end. And the evaluation is overall pretty negative, and briefly summarized as, "And he walked in all the sins that his father did before him, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God." Things get so divergent, especially considering the spelling issue, that one might wonder if we're talking about two wholly separate kings. We're not, by the way. No one actually thinks that these are two separate people when they think about it, but still, things are pretty remarkable here. Perhaps the more conventional account is the one in Chronicles, where King Abijah is celebrated for having won a battle against Jeroboam. This account starts pretty normally. We get a bit about his family. His mother's name is Maacah, and a note on that, there are either a bunch of women in this family with the same name, which, that's possible. There seem to have been a lot of Maacahs out there. Or the chronicler got a bit confused as to which king was the son of Maacah, which is also possible, but these ladies, they're listed as having different fathers, so I kind of suspect that the former is going on. It's debated, like everything. Anyway, we get started right away with Abijah leading a battle. He has 400,000 men, and Jeroboam has 800,000 men. And for all that we have had numerical problems in the Bible before, the book of Chronicles just gets absurd over the next few chapters with its battle reports. So I have no idea what to actually make of this battle as described. 1,200,000 men. Yeah, sure, whatever. Anyway, the two armies draw up near Mount Zimri, and Abijah gives a pretty solid speech, in which he tells his army that Jeroboam has apostatized, while Abijah has patronized the temple lavishly, so they have the true God on their side. Interestingly, though, that the two crimes Jeroboam is accused of are of rebelling against the house of David, which is certainly true enough, and a very specific kind of apostasy, specifically the golden calves, and opening up the priesthood to non-Levites. He is nowhere accused of worshipping pagan gods, whereas Rehoboam and Solomon are both specifically noted for having brought in other gods. So this suggests again that we are looking at a denominational dispute. The speech goes on long enough that apparently Jeroboam is able to send an ambush around the back of Abijah's army. And so now Judah's army is surrounded by an army twice its size and completely surrounding them. However, they have faith in the Lord, and they shout really loudly, and they win so hard that 500,000 Israelite men die on the field. I'm not sure what to make of this battle as described here. The numbers are absurd and can't be trusted. The idea of an army twice Judah's size surrounding them and then still losing them, that's a bit unlikely, but of course, it's ever so slightly less impossible than a battle of over 1,000,000 men. We do have come-from-behind victories in history. And of course, we naturally all assume that all historical speeches are made up or at the very least embellished, but how much can we actually pare back here? The core of the story: Israel fought Judah. Abijah gave a pious speech. Judah won. This core is plausible enough, and it is consistent with the mention of King Asa, who comes up next, that he started his reign with a decade of peace. You'd imagine a decade of peace would start with a big war-concluding battle. But with so few of the details actually checking out, where does that leave us? An historical core with a great victory which accrued legends over time? Or perhaps history transformed into parable, something we might also be seeing in King Asa's time as well. Now the key for the whole story, which is pretty much all we get of Abijah's life, is the line, "The men of Israel were subdued at that time, and the men of Judah prevailed because they relied on the Lord, the God of their fathers." And if this was all we got, well, we get, pretty similar statements all the time from Mesopotamian chronicles. King whoever triumphed over the enemy with the help of Adad and Ishtar, and we wouldn't substantially doubt that story. We'd just mentally strip out the theological element. It's all those extra details that we get that make it seem implausible. But it's all complicated by the treatment of the exact same king in the Book of Kings. Here he gets treated in only 8 confused verses, not an entire chapter, and fully half of those verses aren't actually about him, but about his father and lineage. We learn, in sequence, when he started ruling Judah, then that he ruled for 3 years. We learn his mother's name, Maacah, daughter now of Abishalom, though chroniclers list her as Maacah, daughter of Uriel of Gibeah. We don't know who either of these people are for sure. They're both common names. It could be the people we've seen in the past. It could be just, who knows. Anyway, then we learn that he followed the idolatry of his father and was only partly devoted to Yahweh, that despite the chronicler's speech making him sound quite pious. Now the next 2 lines contrast this to how great David was. And then it says, "Now there was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam all the days of his life." Then it says, "Read the book of Chronicles of the kings of Judah for more information," which of course we don't have. Then it says, "And there was war between Abijam and Jeroboam," making that previous line feel like a scribal insertion. Then it tells us he was buried in the city of David and was succeeded by his son Asa. That buried in the city of David does make it sound like he was considered legitimate in his own time, whatever that gets us. All in all, not the most flattering biography. We know, in general, that Kings and Chronicles are drawing from different sources. After all, Chronicles cites the prophetic writings of Iddo, and Kings is citing the Royal Chronicle here, but it would surely be something to have those original sources. But we don't. Instead, we get to pick between an at best exaggerated account of a battle or a brief summary riddled with what are usually supposed to be scribal errors. But looking a bit more closely at those scribal errors, there's one possibility here that I think has been mostly overlooked by a good deal of commentators, at least the ones I've read. The spelling in Kings for this guy is Abijam, rendered in English with an M on the end rather than the H. This has been considered a scribal error by many, and the variance in the textual tradition suggests that scribes in history have occasionally fixed this to match the name in Chronicles, Abijah. But given that Kings seems to use the M name multiple times, it may not be a scribal error. But my guess is It could be a derogatory renaming, like we saw with Ishbosheth and Mephibosheth. Abijah in Hebrew is the theophoric name meaning my father is Yahweh. Abijam, by contrast, just so happens to also fit the pattern of theophoric names, meaning my father is Yam. Now we got to meet Yam a little bit back in our series on Canaanite stories. The tale of Baal and Yam was the first in the Baal cycle, and there we saw he was a pretty significant god of the waters, and also an enemy of Baal, a god of the sky. There are those who see very strong parallels between the conflict between Baal and Yam and various biblical tales of Yahweh triumphing over various waters, such as parting the sea in Egypt, parting the waters in creation. We see it in the 77 questions of the book of Job. We see it in the various storm god motifs in some of the Psalms. If these interpretations are correct, then at least some of the biblical authors had kind of in the back of their minds a tradition of Yahweh defeating the sea god Yam, and therefore changing the theophoric name of a theological enemy from invoking Yahweh to invoking Yam, thus shaming him. Maybe? Now, it may seem petty to call your theological enemies rude nicknames, but like I said, it's not the first time we've seen the Deuteronomist doing something like this. Now, an alternate possibility requires a bit of thinking about how polytheism works. Now, we're used to seeing Yam as a sort of negative god, because our primary mention of him is in the Baal cycle, where he is an enemy, and also in more abstract discussions of sea god versus sky god, where we tend to find the sky god favored because it's just the dominance of Indo-European tradition and scholarship. We are descended from cultures that picked the sky god over the sea god. That's just how it is. But we have to remember that he was also, in places, worshipped as a major god of the region. For instance, in Syria, we see a good number of Yam-based theophoric names, and in Emar he was apparently one of the subjects of a major festival. Now, it could well be that Abijam was the original name, bestowed by a mother with family ties to a Yam-worshipping region. After all, we know that Judah is importing foreign gods at this time, and at least some of that is blamed on royal international polygamy. That is, the kings are bringing in these foreign women who are bringing in these foreign gods. He could well have won some sort of battle against the northern kingdom, a battle which got, for whatever reason, expanded in the stories of centuries, and then when it came time to write the Chronicles, he may have had this tradition of being a mighty king, son of Rehoboam, yet his mother, who who knows where she was from, may have given him a theologically embarrassing name, at least by the time it comes to write Chronicles. It's one obviously theophoric to a foreign god. It wouldn't have taken much at all, for someone at some point to just correct that embarrassing name into one slightly more appropriate for a champion of the Lord. Now, this last could well explain why the Deuteronomist saw little need to elaborate on Abijam's failings, since it would have been right there in the name for everyone to see, while also allowing more time and sources to develop into a more positive Abijah tradition a few centuries later, when in the time between the Deuteronomist, or that's the writing of Kings and the writing of Chronicles. We don't really have a good explanation here, and whichever you choose plays into how you end up reconstructing the development and apostasy of Israelite religion, just sort of in a minor way. And some sort of interpretation is necessary here. The strict literalist view would tell you that two different men with different names and different mothers took power for the same period of time in the same country between the death of Rehoboam and the death of Jeroboam. Even if you take there to have been a scribal error here, you have to actively make the decision whether Abijah or Abijam was the original. Since both are valid names, it isn't like one is obviously just a muddled up form of the other, and both make sense, given the propensity for the very royal line we're looking at to be condemned for mingling their strange gods with the proper one. You have to pick. It's definitely one guy, and you just have to decide what you like. Now, whatever you think about this fellow, and whatever his name may have been, he and Jeroboam died about the same time, shortly after this battle. And there was apparently a span of peace while Asa took over in Judah and Nadab inherited in Israel. The north is going to be unsettled for a bit, but Asa will have a nice long reign, a gift from God, because of his apparent piety. He made some moves to end the general practices of foreign faiths. He bans cult prostitution, or at least homosexual cult prostitution. There's no mention made of the women. And he also seems to have stripped his grandmother of her royal position. Maacah was apparently the patron of an Asherah grove in the Kidron Valley, and this grove got cut down and set on fire by the nice, pious King Asa. He also seems to have removed idols. No God mentioned again, so increasingly my suspicion is that these are Yahwistic idols, like they have up in the north. He gets them all out of his territory, and he gets them from sections of Ephraim that he captured in the war. Now, he didn't just destroy stuff, though. He also funded temple improvements, and he sponsored Obed the prophet, as this guy went around exhorting people to join the Yahweh cult, and was apparently successful enough in this to attract a number of northerners to move into Judah, where the proper God was being properly worshipped. He did not, however, remove all the high places, which means that there were still enough people worshipping foreign gods that he didn't feel he had the political capital to deal with them generally. It was apparently enough for him that he got the royal household to disassociate with that sort of thing, and that was enough to get him praise from both the chronicler and the Deuteronomist. If someone is of the opinion that there was no Yahwist exclusivism this early in the faith, which is kind of a viewpoint that's supported by a number of incidents we've looked at so far, you need to also take into account supposed reformers like this. What is Asa doing if he's not participating in Yahwist exclusivism? But on the secular front, the territory of Judah seems to have mostly settled into its long-term size at this point, and Asa takes his moment of peace to strengthen the country. He builds fortifications in some of the cities, and some of the fortifications we find archaeologically can maybe kind of, with some controversy, possibly be dated to this period, plus or minus a good bit, and with no real archaeological certainty who built them. I mean, archaeologically, we not only don't know which king built them, but which country built these fortifications, so any assignment of these to King Asa or any other king is based on sticking him somewhere definite in a timeline on the basis of biblical evidence. So basically, not just archaeology. You gotta have the biblical story layered on top of the archaeology to start guessing that, yeah, these fortifications, they might have been built by King Asa. But then we're also told that he organizes the army. The numbers involved here come up to almost 600,000 men, which is obviously silly. But we're told that they are, for the first time, organized in a manner similar to the reformed Neo-Assyrian army, with a combined arms approach of shields, spears, and bows. Now, we are going to talk about the Assyrian army and what made it so special when we get to Assyria, but either Asa is a super early adopter here, or the general idea that the Assyrians made famous was sort of already in the air at this point, or this could just be an anachronism. The writer knew that Asa fought battles, and he assumed that they were fought in a way that the writer was familiar with at the point when the whole book was written, at which point the Assyrian system would have been by and far and away the most famous. Now, the exact composition of his military and the exact design of his forts, it's not actually super important because the exact details of his military adventures are complete nonsense either way. And yet, as always, through it all, there's possibly a core of truth here. I say, as always, maybe. Anyway, again, it's a case where if the Chronicle merely told us that Asa fortified cities, expanded the army, and fought against enemies both north and south, we would largely accept that and be pretty happy with it. We would, of course, wish for more details, but here we get some extra details, and we kind of wish we hadn't. The first military engagement we hear about comes after a decade or so of peace. All of a sudden, from out of nowhere, Zerah the Cushite arrives from the south with a 1,000,000-man army. They meet the Judahite army in the valley of Zephathah, and of course, with 1,000,000 men, they badly outnumber the poor Judahites. But King Asa has God on his side. He gives a real good prayer and completely defeats the Cushites and plunders all their stuff. We have no idea who Zerah the Cushite is. Cush, of course, is a vague term for the vast southlands, roughly Ethiopia and Yemen, but it's a super fuzzy idea, and let's be honest, the Israelites themselves may not have been super clear on the geography down there. Some Bibles translate this as Zerah the Ethiopian, but this is basically guessing at the same kind of thing. He could have been an Egyptian general, though Egypt is not mentioned in the account, and we don't have any mention of a Canaanite campaign from Pharaoh Osirkon, the guy who we assume is in charge of Egypt around this time. He could also have been a warlord from Arabia, leading some nomadic raiders, which would explain why Asa had so much livestock to sacrifice following this victory. What he definitely wasn't was an Ethiopian king with a fixed kingdom way down south, attacking all the way up here for no reason. Even if he was ethnically from the south somewhere, his base of operations must have been much closer to Israel, because even Egypt is having trouble getting armies down to its southern region at this point, and they have the Nile. The logistics for any minor state to move an actual army that distance are pretty much out of reach. As we're going to see, when the Assyrian army actually does manage to move itself long distances, it's kind of amazing. What's also definitely not accurate is the 1,000,000 men, for reasons that we've discussed a number of times already. Populations in the region are actually probably on the rise at this point, and there are some super upper bound estimates that are going to put the entire Levant at 1,000,000 people about a century from now. But no Ethiopian army attacked with 1,000,000 people all at once, and Israel's army was not half that size. It wasn't even a fraction of a half of that size. And so with so much nonsense, again, attached to this story, can we even say there was any sort of single push invasion? Maybe by Egypt, but more likely by just some random force out of Arabia? I mean, by itself, getting invaded from the south seems plausible enough, and King Asa beating them back would certainly be something to celebrate, but we're missing a lot here. Whatever the case, we only hear about one more war aside from this, though our two sources can't agree on how much violence there was aside from these two wars. Chronicles has it that the entire reign was peaceful, punctuated by only two attacks, this Ethiopian one around year 10 and an attack from northern Israel around year 36, near the end of Asa's life. Kings, however, completely omits this supposed Cushite incursion, mentions that Israel and Judah were at war basically the entire time that Baasha was on the throne in the north. We're going to get to him in a minute. And since the years for Baasha and Asa pretty much overlap, that's going to be most of this period. And it gives no sense at all when the matter of the fort at Ramah took place. But to understand the context with King Baasha, we need to turn back up north, into the kingdom of Israel. About the same time Asa took the throne in Judah, Jeroboam's son Nadab inherited the throne of Israel. We don't hear much specific about Nadab, but he only lasts about a year. In that year, he continues the idolatry of his father, making no significant religious changes, and he also appears to send an army out to the town of Gibbethon. Now, this is a bit of an interesting place. It was in the original territory of Dan before Dan moved north, and it's listed as a Levitical city. At some point, possibly during all the confusion of Jeroboam's split from Judah and the Egyptian invasion, it appears to have been captured by the Philistines. Nadab's first and pretty much only act as king is to lead an army to bring it back into Israelite territory. And let's be honest, that's a fair enough thing for a king to focus on. But ultimately, things go wrong, as a fellow named Baasha, son of some guy named Abijah, so this is a guy with a Yahwistic name, and of the tribe of Issachar, decides that he's been chosen by God to be king. He kills Nadab, then goes in and kills Nadab's whole family. Pretty standard stuff, and this was apparently at the command of God, as all the best slaughters are. Now, having emptied the throne, he then proceeded to sit in it, and much to the Deuteronomist's disappointment, he's pretty much ends up with all the same policies as Jeroboam and Nadab, at least religiously speaking. Jehu the prophet shows up and condemns Baasha, and everything else you could possibly want to know about this king is of course preserved in a book that no longer exists. So aside from this, the only thing we know about Baasha is that he made war against his neighbors, which of course that describes pretty much every ancient king. But that gets us now finally to the Baasha-Asa conflict, which was either, according to Chronicles, an isolated incident, or, according to Kings, one part of a much larger outbreak of the Israel-Judah conflict, likely one which simmered over the course of raids and tensions and provocations more than just a continuous running battle. Fortunately, the narrative makes it clear to us who the good guy is in all of this. Asa, king of Judah, has spent his relatively peaceful and stable reign building up defensive works and strengthening his army. Up in the north, Baasha must surely know that a stronger southern neighbor is always going to be a more significant threat for his kingdom, and so he responds by building up a fortification in the strategic border town of Ramah. Makes sense. Your neighbor's building up? I better build up too. But of course, suddenly, Asa's northern neighbor is building up, and so since Asa feels threatened by the greater strength of northern Israel, he caused his neighbors to feel threatened, and then that makes Asa feel even more threatened. And this new strategic point does seem to allow Baasha to control access, presumably trade but also diplomatic access into Judah from the north. And so, all this tensions aside, Asa needs this fort gone. But in a move that likely happened more than occasionally, but it's only rarely recorded because it's less glamorous for the king, Asa declined to attack directly. Instead, he takes some of his stored up wealth and offers it to King Ben-Hadad of Aram Damascus. Now, some Bible translations are going to say Syria, but we actually might know something about this guy archaeologically. There's a monument which may be to the god Melkart, or it may be to King Ben-Hadad. The subject is debated, but if it is the Damascene king, then it would be a nice little extra biblical tie-in to this story, even if it's all pretty contentless, just telling us, hey, there was this guy, he was king in Damascus. He was great. Anyway, all this money was on offer to Ben-Hadad so that he would join a sort of alliance and attack Israel from the north while they were distracted with this arms race on their southern border. The Arameans, of course, gladly took the money. Then they gladly took a swath of towns along the northern edge of Israel. Now, this naturally distracted Baasha of Israel, and the Israelite troops moved northwards to deal with this. Asa then was able to sweep in from behind, take the still under construction fort at Ramah, deconstruct the fort, and then use all those materials to build two forts, one in Geba, one in Mizpah, to defend the Judahite side of the border more completely. All in all, it's a pretty clever ploy, but perhaps it was a bit too clever, because he'd made two mistakes. He had paid Ben-Hadad out of treasure which had already been consecrated to the temple of Yahweh, and probably because that was just the richest institution in the kingdom at this point, and this naturally encouraged the priestly class, here led by a guy named Hanami the seer, to rebuke him. Also, there is some concern in commentary, though not in the text itself, that a son of David had encouraged foreigners to take away land that God had given to the Israelites as a whole. Now, Asa responds to these issues by throwing the priest who complained in prison, and then a bit later he's going to get a foot infection, and then, because he's going to trust in doctors instead of trusting in God, he dies. But Asa's death hasn't actually happened yet. That's just the theological consequences. Baasha still needs to die, which he does shortly after getting pincered by Judah and the Arameans. This death is blamed on God, and seems generally pretty natural. He's succeeded by his son Elah, and Elah rules for 2 years, and as best we can tell, he spent most of those 2 years sodding drunk in the capital until one of his chariot commanders, a fellow named Zimri, puts a blade in the king in hopes of replacing him. Following this, though, things get a bit weird. Now, remember when Baasha assassinated Nadab, the army was hanging out in Gibbethon, trying to take that city from the Philistines. Well, here we are, some 30-ish years later, during another kingly assassination, and the army is again at Gibbethon, though this time the king isn't with them. Now it really could just be a coincidence, or it could be narrative confusion. The important thing here, though, is that the army was not in the capital with the king when he died. And as soon as they heard about the assassination, they decided to support their commander to be king. Except that commander was not Zimri, the guy who actually killed the king. It seems they had two commanders, and one half of the army supported a fellow named Omri, and one half supported a guy named Tibni, and 0 halves supported Zimri, who ended up being king and also ended up being alive for only 7 more days, which is presumably the amount of time it took the army to make their way back to the capital at Tirzah. By the way, the capital is at Tirzah now. I forgot to mention that. It moved over at some point. Doesn't really matter yet. The capital was besieged pretty quickly, and with Zimri dead, the dispute as to who should be king it flared up all of a sudden. You got two good candidates. We don't get much detail here, but Omri proved to be the stronger candidate, and Tibni found himself suffering from a case of not being alive anymore, and so the succession crisis was thereby resolved. Now, Omri is going to be pretty super important in our secular histories of Israel. This dynasty that he's founding right now is the one that's going to be remembered until the final end of the northern kingdom in extra-biblical sources. And as a result, the northern kingdom will typically be known in the cuneiform record as the land ruled by the Omride dynasty, and only infrequently referred to as Israel or some other variation of that, later also be called Samaria. And it's pretty clear from what we'll see next episode that Omri was a king who threw his weight around, at least to some extent. But despite that, we get nothing at all about him in Chronicles, just a handful of genealogical mentions and very little in Kings. Now, this is probably ideological. He appears to have been broadly successful and broadly idolatrous, and so neither biblical writer had any great desire to put success and idolatry together. But we do hear that he ruled for about 12 years. The first half he ruled from Tirzah, which had been the seat of government since Baasha, and in the second half he purchased a good plot of land on a hill to build a whole new capital city, which would come to be called Samaria. Now, this new city will be the capital of Omri's dynasty because they'll be a pretty successful nation for the next 2 centuries, generally speaking, and it's going to get cemented in everyone's mind that Omri's dynasty are the kings of this place and Samaria is the capital, which is why many people are going to call it the land of Omri, and many more are going to call it Samaria. And indeed, going forward, it's going to just be Samaria after the fall of both kingdoms. And only relatively few are going to remember the name of the place as Israel. We're going to talk about this next episode for sure, the whole naming issue. But our biblical tale of Omri pretty much ends right there, with the usual note that now the rest of the acts of Omri that he did and the might that he showed, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? To which we first get to say, are they? I have no idea. Thanks for the lost citation. It's bad enough when Wikipedia points to a dead link, but when the Bible does it, that's even worse. But then there's also that bit, the might that he showed. We don't hear about him showing any might anywhere. But this line is, at least in part, a reference to the fact that Omri conquered the Moabites. It may be that he re-conquered the Moabites after Solomon or Jeroboam had lost them, or it could be that this is actually the first time that an Israelite nation had ever actually forced the Moabites into submission. And I do present both views here because this show has, for longer than anticipated, been pretty dominantly traditionalist just by the nature of having to follow the biblical text. I didn't expect that it would take 20 episodes, but here we finally are at the place that many sincere people would say is maybe kind of sort of the actual start of Israelite history, with everything that came before that being little more than unverifiable legends. But of course you might say, didn't we just last episode have the Bubastite portal, which confirmed the Egyptian invasion of Shishak from the Bible? Well, we did, but remember that the Egyptian monument never mentioned the name of Israel, or in fact, Shishak himself, just a bunch of cities that we identify thanks to the biblical text as Israelite, or really Judahite, and a pharaoh who we identify, thanks to the biblical text, as Shishak. Similarly, much of the extremely scattered archaeology and the few prior Egyptian mentions of Yahweh and Israel can certainly be drawn up to support the biblical text, but without that text, none of it's going to stand on its own and build anything like the story that we have put together following the biblical text. And thus, for those who reject the holy word of God outright, or will at best allow it to be a support when archaeology provides a primary foundation, none of that stuff counts as anything more than interesting but disconnected puzzle pieces. Imagine, as an analogy, a jigsaw puzzle. You've put together the outside edges, or at least part of those outside edges. That's your archaeology. And then you got this big old chunk in the center that's put together as well, and it really makes a nice clear shape. That's your scripture. Now we slowly find more pieces, but it's pretty clear that any connections from the edge to the center are going to be extremely tenuous unless someone finds a real remarkable cache of pieces under the sofa or somewhere. Now we can argue over all kinds of things with this puzzle. If this edge should be on the top or on the side, or if that piece really fits on this side or that side. But of course, since we don't actually know where all these pieces came from, we've just been told where they come from, and we definitely don't have a picture on the side of our box. There's this lingering suspicion among many that our two sets of pieces might actually come from two wholly different puzzles and will never actually link up. Now, these people would tell us to remove that center completely. Go put it on a different table. Now, if we do this, we may never find the edges of the central puzzle, and we may never find the center of that edge puzzle. So we're always going to have two incomplete pictures. But these people would say that having these incomplete pictures is better than having a wrong picture by trying to force together two incompatible sets. Now, of course, the risk in this analogy is that if all these pieces really are from the same set, then we're going to miss out on an incredible picture, which is essentially the picture I've sort of been waving at a little bit in these last 20 episodes by assuming the historicity of some portions of the biblical story. But it is important to remember that the people who see two puzzles among our pieces, these skeptical Bible rejectors, they're often well-meaning, intelligent people. But whatever our perspective on things, with Omri of Israel, things finally change. We got some pieces that go from the edge to a center. We don't know about the stuff that came before, but we're starting to put some pieces together. Now, I've already made the case for my perspective on the Bible as history, but whatever you think about it, there's no question that the books of Kings and Chronicles are in fact histories written centuries after the relevant events. Once we get to Omri, though, we have our first near contemporary source, written in the lifetime of Omri's grandson at the very least, and thus generally assumed to be historically reliable in a different way than the Bible is. This is the sort of written source we love in Mesopotamian history, and presumably every other kind of history as well. We could do a bit of debate as to whether Omri or his son Ahab really counts as the first historically attested king, because Ahab's source, it's going to come next episode, is going to be within Ahab's own lifetime, written presumably only a few years after the relevant battle, while Omri's source is 2 generations later and mostly focused on his grandson. But honestly, compared to the size and scope of most biblical historical debates, Whether Omri or Ahab counts as the first historical guy, that's basically pedantry. So Omri, as far as I'm concerned, is our first historical king, because we have a document called the Mesha Stela, written by King Mesha of Moab, in which he complains that Omri invaded his country and oppressed his people, then describes how he won a war of independence against Jehoram, and describes it in very similar terms to what we hear in the Book of Kings, though of course with a rather different focus and perspective. And so we know that King Omri of Israel is a real historical figure. We know that he oppressed the Moabites, or at least conquered them, which probably felt pretty oppressive to the Moabites at the time. So join us next time, as Omri then proceeds to die, and have his throne pass on to his son Ahab, about whom far, far more can be said, both in terms of biblical narrative and in terms of one of the most important historical battles in biblical historiography. Thank you for listening.